This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 29. Baron Hochous. How long they had been delayed by the avoided collision, the ensuing excitement, and the forcing apart of the cars, Thurley could never have told. It seemed to her another afternoon a long way removed from the earlier hours, when at length she and Robley were once more gliding down the road with the lowered sun redly blazing upon them. She was driving automatically, reactionary steadiness having succeeded her nerve collapse. She was still a trifle pale, but had pulled herself together with amazing promptness. After the ordeal was over, and had stoutly refused the services of a dozen chauffeurs that Stuyvesant was ready to engage, they had not resumed their former gaiety of conversation. Indeed, they had scarcely spoken at all for the 15 minutes elapsed since once more getting under way. They came to the great iron drawbridge over another winding of the Harlem River, where railroad structure, shipping, trolley, confusion, and a mighty exemplification of the city's activities abruptly blotted out all but memory of the quiet glades behind. "We seem fated for excitement," said Stuyvesant at last, "especially with this car. I wonder what the third will be, and when." Thurley glanced at him with one of her fainter smiles. "You believe in threes? You're superstitious?" "Oh, I don't know. I'm sure everyone has a few superstitions, I presume. There does seem to be a sort of fatality in trios. We may not get our third experience, of course, but then—" "Well, why ride in this old car any more?" Thurley interrupted, half in earnest. "I don't believe I shall." "If it's fated you will, you can't escape it," he assured her laughingly, yet a little serious nevertheless. "We are mere helpless puppets of our destiny, and it works both ways. If we can't escape our cataracts of disaster, neither can we sidestep our zephyrs of joy." Thurley looked grave. "I think I prefer cataracts of joy and zephyrs of disaster." "May they come that way," he said devoutly. "I would order them so if I could." "Oh, it looked like a whirlwind of death a while ago," she said after a moment of silence. "Please, if you must have a third of our experiences, begin to tame it down right away." There was no particular pleasure in the threading the uptown streets of Gotham, as Thurley presently discovered. By Stuyvesant's direction she wound across and down strange thoroughfares with all her ordinary skill, however, till at length they rolled through Lenox Avenue, and so once more to Central Park for the final charm of their journey. The last of the orange sunshine was casting a ruddy glow of day-end splendour on the trees and lawns of the still populous roadways, as they joined the homeward roving procession of motors and open carriages. Thoroughly intent as before on the guidance of the control of the car, where a moment's reckless driving might precipitate some huge disaster, had barely taken time to enjoy a glance at the sun's soft glory and the cheering ruby background for the trees. She did not note the rapid approach of a carriage wherein two men were riding and inspecting all the crowds. Stuyvesant beheld the conveyance, or rather felt his glance attracted to one of the men on its cushions. The man was stiff in his poise and leaning angularly forward in his seat as he stared with concentrated intensity at the girl driving the car. It was Baron von Hochous, Ambassador Extraordinary from Herzegovina, and Wenk at his side. In a vain, rapid search for the missing Grand Duke, they had finally adopted this expedient, trusting that they might perchance discover him riding in the park. The little man, more iron-visaged than before, with this vision of Thurley to set the lines of his countenance, saw nothing of Stuyvesant, or at most had given him a glance, but Robley returned his intensified stare, instantly puzzled to know where it was he had seen this face before. The exchange of scrutinies lasted but a moment, when the auto and the carriage shuffled into moving pack of life and parted by the ceaseless manoeuvres of the traffic, and the Fates continued each its own way. The Baron turned galvanically as one on a pivot in his seat, and Stuyvesant craned his neck to the limit, and the incident was closed. "Did you see him? See that man?" said Robley, wheeling at once to the girl. "He stared at you as if he had seen a spirit." "What man?" said Thurley. "I didn't notice any one at all." "Who in the deuce? I've seen him before, but where?" continued Stuyvesant. "He's someone in particular. I wish I could think. I know him well, but where or how?" "New York has a large staring population," Thurley ventured. "Perhaps he's just the star starer, or star gazer, if you prefer, of the town." Stuyvesant smiled, but his thoughts were far afield. "It always worries me to forget a thing I ought to remember. It seems to me he did me a favour some time. Couldn't have been at Newport or here in New York. Doesn't a thing like that get on a fellow's mind and stick like a ghost?" Thurley saw no necessity of taking the matter so seriously. "Are ghosts really known to be sticky? Ah, I remember, of course." He suddenly turned to the girl, a new sort of gravity depicted on his face. "If you had only seen him," he added. "No wonder he stared. I mean, he was Baron von Hochous of Herzegovina, one of the biggest men in the kingdom." For a moment Thurley met his gaze blankly, till of a sudden the full significance of this intelligence, in the light of what Robley believed of herself, burst in upon her swiftly moving thoughts. She coloured instantly, visions of the Grand Duke Karl and 100 kindred incidents and lucubrations crowding thickly upon her. "The Baron?" she started. Stuyvesant, noting her confusion, was instantly contrite. "I beg your pardon. I hardly stopped to think. The abruptness of the meeting, my memory. I hope I have not distressed you unintentionally." "Oh, it's not worth mentioning," Thurley murmured, still somewhat nonplussed nevertheless, and wondering what, if anything, the visit of another dignitary from Herzegovina might imply, and how much his presence in Gotham might affect herself and Alice. "You met him on the Continent? You've been to Herzegovina?" "No, at Berlin. I've never been to his country, but hope. Well, he did me a very great service 2 years ago, and was good enough to say I had done him a greater. We became very friendly. I liked him through and through." Thurley was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her companion was aware that the subject was dismissed. "I believe I shall not drive all the way down through the park," she said. "I begin to feel a little recurrence of something from what we went through." Stuyvesant, having hoped all afternoon from one of the little familiar exchanges of a word or a glance between herself and him, something that would hark back to their initial meeting, perhaps, or to some of the few sweet occasions since, was loath to realise that their day was at an end, with nothing said between them to arouse his oscillating hopes. "It's a pity the sun must sink a day like this," he said. "I wish it might reverse its motion and begin things all over again." "Oh, no," she expostulated warmly. "It has been far too strenuous for me. I'd rather start a new one, please, and leave a few things out." "But not our ride and sense of comradeship." She looked at him quietly, softly, despite her sense of judgment. "It has been like that, hasn't it? I mean, shall I drive you home again?" It was just a flash of that wondrous afternoon when joy had eased his pain. His heart bounded lightly at her look and smile, and the shadowy presence of her softer mood, before it was merged into something else, elusive and evanescent. "Oh, no, my man will drive me home," he said. "Would you wish to have him take you away again and leave you somewhere in the park?" "I enjoyed that visit to the park," she answered, and speeding up the car, she drove it down the avenue to which they had emerged, and was presently halting by the curb before the Van Kirk abode. He assisted her out, and, thrilled at the clasp of her little hand for a moment entrusted to his own, for a second he held her gaze. "Shall I see you again, Miss Thurley, soon?" She arched her brows in her quaintly piquant way. "I hardly expect to vanish or become invisible. Good bye until we meet again. I've enjoyed it nearly all." She ran up the steps and waved him adieu, and her smile made his heart rejoice. Then presently he was gone with his waiting chauffeur, and thoroughly encountering Alice on the stairs, paused halfway up, as if the weight of her news could be carried no farther that day. "More startling things for you to hear," she said. "Who do you think we just passed in the park?" "I know," said Alice, instantly mimicking soldierly rigidity. "Baron von Hochous, all sorts of things from Herzegovina. Am I right?" "Good gracious," said Thurley, once more a trifle pale from over taxations of the hour. "But how—" "He has already been here this afternoon. He is coming again at 8 o'clock, and has asked to see you alone." Thurley sat down on the stairs. "Aren't they getting thick?" she said, faintly smiling up at Alice. "But what's the use of worrying? Mr. Stuyvesant and I were nearly killed by a runaway automobile." It was Alice's turn to feel a wilting of the heart. She too sat down on the stairs. "Thurley, you're pale, child. Tell me all about it." "Well, it didn't last long, thank the stars," imparted Thurley, and, reducing the story to the minimum of facts and horrors, she related what had occurred. "It happened to end all right," she continued presently, "but it made me a little weak. The other car was damaged pretty badly, but we were barely scratched. Of course there were plenty of people to take the children home, and the awful dead thing away." "Made you a little weak?" repeated Alice. "Good heavens! Robley couldn't have driven you home. Who did?" "Oh, there was no good reason for hiring a man," said Thurley simply. "I was soon all right again." "You drove the car after that?" "Why, of course." Alice swallowed hard at her emotions. "I think you are safe enough to meet the Baron alone." But she put out her arms, slid down a step, and strained Thurley tightly against her bosom. "You frighten me, dear," she added maternally. "I some way feel I'd rather you wouldn't ride with Robley again. There's a hoodoo on his car." Thurley laughed in sheer relief from overstrain of strength and nerves. "Robley said something like that himself. But I almost love that car. He said we'd have to look out for the third time and its charm. Dear girl," Alice added in her tender mood, "I have launched you in violent waters, apparently." "Mostly Florida waters," Thurley laughed. "I'm the luckiest girl in the world, after all." Alice kissed her, rose, assisted Thurley to her feet, and with one arm snugly about the slender waist, went with her up the stairs. Chapter 29.